The storm roared across the Caribbean coast like a beast unchained, its winds tearing at the cliffs and hurling waves that could splinter a galleon into kindling. In the heart of this tempest, on a jagged outcrop overlooking a bay that had swallowed countless ships, stood the shack of Captain Elias Crow, a pirate who'd turned his back on the sea and the world. But tonight, something washed ashore that would bring an entire tribe to his doorstep, and they weren't coming to sing his praises. What Elias found in the storm's wrath would force him to choose between the solitude he'd sworn to protect and a risk that could burn his world to ash. It was 1715, and Elias hadn't spoken to a living soul in 5 years. His shack, pieced together from driftwood and salvaged nails, clung to the cliff like a barnacle, its single window rattling under the storm's assault. At 42, Elias was a shadow of the captain who'd once commanded the Black Tempest, a ship feared from Nassau to Tortuga. Betrayal had ended that life. His first mate's knife, his crew's blood, his daughter's screams as colonial raiders torched their haven. Now he lived for the rhythm of the tides, fishing to survive, speaking only to the gulls and the ghosts that haunted his dreams. The storm, though, cared nothing for his isolation. It tore at his nets, threatening the only livelihood he had left. Cursing under his breath, Elias donned his oilskin coat and stepped into the gale, the rain stinging his face like 1,000 tiny blades. He was halfway to the shore, battling winds that threatened to hurl him into the sea, when he saw it, a small, crumpled figure sprawled across the rocks, waves lapping at its edges like hungry dogs. Elias froze, his heart hammering louder than the thunder. It was a girl no older than 16, her dark hair plastered to a face pale as moonlight. Her garments, woven with tribal patterns, were shredded, clinging to her skin like a second wound. Blood seeped from a gash on her arm, mixing with the salt water pooling beneath her. Her eyes, wide and desperate, locked onto his, and in that moment, Elias saw something he'd spent years trying to forget. The gaze of his daughter, Marina, pleading for rescue as flames consumed their home. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back. This was the Caribbean in the age of empires. Helping a stranger, especially one from the Carib tribes, was a death sentence. The colonial governors in Port Royal hanged men for less, and the Carib were no kinder to outsiders who crossed them. Stories whispered in taverns spoke of their canoes slicing through the night, their arrows tipped with vengeance. Elias had built his shack far from trade routes to avoid such trouble, to escape the world that had taken everything from him. Helping this girl would invite that world back with all its knives and fire. But as she reached a trembling hand toward him, her lips mouthing a word he couldn't hear over the storm's howl, something cracked inside him. Compassion, buried under years of guilt, stirred like a tide turning. He knelt beside her, the rocks biting into his knees. Her skin was cold as the sea, her breath shallow and ragged. "Hold on, lass," he muttered, his voice rusty from disuse. He scooped her into his arms, her weight no heavier than a sailcloth bundle, and staggered toward his shack. The storm fought him every step as if the sea itself wanted her back. Inside, he laid her by the fire, its flickering light revealing the depth of her wounds. A jagged cut ran from her shoulder to her elbow, and bruises bloomed across her throat like dark flowers. She was Carib, no question. The intricate beadwork on her torn dress marked her as someone of importance. Elias's hands shook as he fetched water and a rag, his mind racing with the consequences of what he'd just done. As he cleaned her wounds, the girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She spoke in a language he didn't know, rapid and weak, her hands gesturing toward her mouth, then the fire. Hunger. Fear. Meat. Elias didn't need to understand her words to know what she was asking. He had fish stew simmering on the hearth, a meager meal for a man who lived alone but enough to share. He ladled it into a wooden bowl, the steam carrying the scent of salt and survival. Her hands trembled as she took it, sipping with the desperation of someone who'd stared death in the face and refused to blink. For the first time, Elias saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, and it hit him like a cannon shot. Hope was dangerous. Hope got people killed. Outside, the storm began to quiet, the wind dropping to a low moan. Elias stepped to the window, peering through the warped glass. The bay was a churning black void, but something else caught his ear, a sound that turned his blood to ice. War drums, faint but unmistakable, rolling across the water like a heartbeat from the deep. The Carib were coming and they were close. Elias turned back to the girl, now slumped against his chair, the bowl empty in her lap. Around her neck hung a bone pendant carved with a shark's jaw, a symbol he'd heard of in hushed tones, the mark of Chief Tino's bloodline. This wasn't just any girl. She was a daughter of the sea's fiercest warriors, and they'd tear his world apart to get her back. What would you do if you were Elias? Risk everything for a stranger who could bring a war to your door, or turn away to protect the life you've built? Drop your choice in the comments because what happens next will change everything. The drums grew louder, and Elias knew one thing for certain. The night was far from over. The fire in Elias Crow's shack crackled, casting flickering shadows across the girl's pale face as she sipped the last of the fish stew. Her name, he'd learned, was Kehlani, a whispered word she'd managed between trembling breaths. Outside, the storm had faded to a low growl, leaving the Caribbean night heavy with the scent of salt and wet earth. But the war drums, those relentless pulses that had chilled Elias's blood, grew louder, closer, rolling across the bay like a warning from the deep. Captain Elias Crow, once a pirate who danced with death on the high seas, now faced a new kind of peril, one that could bring a tribe's wrath to his doorstep. He'd saved Kehlani, but at what cost? The answer was creeping closer, and it carried spears. Elias knelt by the hearth, his hands still damp from cleaning Kehlani's wounds. Her tribal dress, torn and bloodied, hung drying by the fire, its beadwork glinting like stars caught in a net. She was Carib, no doubt, and the bone pendant around her neck, a shark's jaw carved with intricate spirals, marked her as someone of rank. Elias's mind churned with memories he'd buried deep. 5 years ago he'd been Captain Crow, leading the Black Tempest through storms and cannon fire. His daughter, Marina, had been his compass, her laughter brighter than any treasure. But a first mate's betrayal, Judas with a cutlass, had led colonial raiders to their camp. Marina's screams, the flames, the blood, they drowned out the sea itself. Elias had fled, not out of cowardice, but because living was the only way to carry her memory. Helping Kehlani felt like a betrayal of that solitude, yet her eyes, wide with trust, echoed Marina's in a way that cut deeper than any blade. He shook off the ghosts and focused on the girl. Kehlani's breathing had steadied, but her hands clutched the bowl as if it anchored her to life. She spoke again, her voice stronger but still foreign, her hands miming a ship, then pointing to her pendant. Elias didn't need to speak Carib to understand. Her tribe was coming, and they'd come by sea. The drums weren't just a warning, they were a promise. He stood, his boots creaking on the uneven floor, and checked the window. The bay was a dark mirror reflecting the moon's pale glow, but beyond the dunes shadows moved, lithe, deliberate, like panthers stalking prey. The Carib were already here, and they weren't waiting for dawn. A sharp knock at the door made Elias's hand fly to the flintlock pistol on his belt, a relic from his pirating days. "Who's there?" he growled, his voice rough as gravel. The door creaked open, revealing Jonah, the grizzled fisherman who lived a mile down the coast. His face, weathered as old sailcloth, was taut with fear. "Elias, you've gone and done it now," Jonah hissed, stepping inside without invitation. His eyes darted to Kehlani, then back to Elias. "The Carib are circling, mate. Word spread, a girl's missing, one of Tino's blood. They'll burn this shack and you with it if they think you've harmed her." Jonah's hands trembled, betraying the bravado in his voice. He'd seen the Caribs work. Villages razed, ships vanished without a trace. "Hand her over, Elias. Save yourself while you can." Elias's jaw tightened. "Hand her over?" The words tasted like ash. Kehlani's gaze met his, her eyes sharp despite her weakness, as if she sensed the weight of Jonah's words. She gestured again, more urgently, pointing to the pendant, then the sea. "Ship," she said, her English broken but clear. "Tino, come." Elias's stomach twisted. Chief Tino, the Carib leader whose name was whispered in fear from Barbados to the Bahamas, was coming for his kin. Helping Kehlani had been a gamble, keeping her here was suicide. But abandoning her, leaving her to the mercy of the night or Jonah's cowardice, felt like losing Marina all over again. "I ain't handin' her over," Elias said, his voice low but firm. "Not till I know she's safe." Jonah's face darkened. "You're a fool, Crow. You think you can stand against a tribe? They'll gut you and leave your bones for the crabs." He stepped closer, his breath sour with rum. "I'm tellin' you, give her up or we're all dead by mornin'." Elias's hand tightened on the pistol, but before he could answer, Kehlani stirred, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "No, fight," she said, her eyes locked on Elias. "Help me." The words were a plea, but they carried a strength that silenced Jonah's protests. Elias felt the weight of his choice settle like a stone in his chest. He'd chosen to save her, and now he'd have to face what came next. He moved to the door, barring it with a heavy plank. The shack's walls groaned under the wind's last gasps, but the drums were relentless, their rhythm quickening like a pulse before a strike. Elias checked his pistol, then grabbed a rusted cutlass from above the hearth. "Jonah, you wanna run, go now," he said. But I'm stayin'. Jonah cursed under his breath but stayed, his fear warring with some grudging loyalty. Kelani, propped against the chair, watched them both, her hands steady now as if drawing strength from Elias's resolve. Outside, the shadows grew bolder, their forms clearer against the dunes. One figure broke from the pack, creeping toward the shack with the silence of a specter. The silence after the war drums stopped was heavier than the storm itself, a quiet that pressed against Elias Crow's shack like a held breath. Through the warped window, the Carib scout's painted face lingered, his eyes locked on Kelani, the bone-handled knife in his hand glinting with menace. Elias's grip tightened on his cutlass, its rusted edge a poor match for what was coming. The Caribbean night was alive with shadows, dozens of them moving like wraiths across the dunes. Chief Tino's warriors had come for the girl, and Elias, once a pirate who'd outrun death, now stood at its doorstep. But what unfolded next wasn't the bloodbath he'd braced for, it was something far stranger, and it would turn his world upside down. Inside the shack, Kelani struggled to her feet, her wounds slowing her but not her spirit. "No fight," she whispered, her broken English sharp with urgency. She pointed to her shark jaw pendant, then to the sea, her hands trembling but resolute. Elias didn't have time to decipher her meaning. The door shuddered under a heavy blow and Jonah, the fisherman, flinched, muttering, "We're done for, Crow." Elias shoved the plank aside and opened the door, cutlass raised, ready to face whatever came. But the sight beyond stopped him cold. A fleet of Carib canoes, their prows carved with serpents, cut through the moonlit bay like sharks slicing water. At their head stood a man whose presence dwarfed the night itself. Chief Tino, his feathered headdress swaying, his eyes burning with a father's fury. "Give me my daughter," Tino said, his voice low but carrying the weight of a cannon. His warriors, their faces painted with jagged white streaks, formed a semicircle, spears and bows gleaming in the moonlight. Elias stepped forward, Kelani leaning on his arm, her breath shallow but her gaze steady. "She's here," Elias said, his voice rough but firm. "I didn't harm her. Found her washed ashore half dead." Tino's eyes narrowed, scanning Kelani's bloody dress, her bruised throat. The scout from the window stepped forward, his knife still drawn, snarling in Carib. Elias didn't need to know the words to feel the accusation. Kidnapper, outsider, enemy. Kelani's voice broke the tension, weak but clear. "Elias, save me," she said, her English halting but deliberate. She turned to Tino, speaking rapidly in her native tongue, her hands gesturing to the sea, then to Elias. The chief's expression shifted, suspicion warring with something softer. Hope, maybe. Elias's heart pounded as Kelani's words spilled out, and then came the twist that changed everything. "No Carib," she said, pointing to her wounds. "White men, chains, ship." Elias's blood ran cold. Colonial slavers, not a storm, had left her for dead. Kelani wasn't just any girl, she was Tino's daughter, a symbol of his tribe's fight for peace with settlers, targeted to spark a war. The scout, unconvinced, spat a challenge, his knife flashing as he stepped toward Elias. "Liar," he barked, his broken English laced with venom. He took her. The warriors tensed, some raising weapons, others murmuring, their unity fraying. Tino raised a hand, silencing them, but the scout's fury burned on, his scars telling a story of old grudges. Elias's mind raced, hand Kelani over and risk her safety, or stand his ground and face a tribe's wrath. His past whispered failure. Marina, lost to raiders because he'd trusted the wrong man. But Kelani's hand on his arm, steady despite her weakness, anchored him. "I ain't your enemy," Elias said to Tino, his voice low. "She's alive because of me." Tino's gaze softened, but before he could speak, the ground trembled under the thud of hooves. From the cliffs above, colonial soldiers descended, their red coats stark against the night, muskets gleaming. Their leader, Captain Harrow, reined in his horse, his eyes cold as steel. "Hand over the savage girl," he barked, his voice dripping with authority. "She's property of the crown and you, Crow, are aiding a fugitive." Elias's stomach twisted. Harrow's presence wasn't chance. The slavers who'd attacked Kelani were his men, and now they'd come to finish the job, pinning the blame on Elias to justify a massacre. The warriors shifted, their spears turning toward the soldiers, but Tino's eyes locked on Elias, a question unspoken. Ally or enemy? The air crackled with tension, the bay's waves crashing like a countdown. Elias stood between two worlds, a tribe ready to kill for their kin, and soldiers itching for blood to fuel their empire. If you were Elias, would you trust Tino's warriors to stand with you, or face Harrow's men alone? Drop your choice in the comments because the next move will decide who lives and who dies under this moonlit sky. The Caribbean night crackled with danger, the bay's waves crashing like war drums as colonial soldiers faced Chief Taino's warriors on the rocky shore. Elias Crow stood between them, Kehlani's frail form leaning against him, her shark jaw pendant glinting in the moonlight. Captain Harrow's red-coated soldiers leveled muskets, their torches casting jagged shadows, while Taino's spearmen formed a wall, their painted faces unyielding. The air was thick with the promise of blood, and Elias, once a pirate who'd outrun empires, now held the spark that could ignite a massacre. But he wasn't ready to die, not yet, and the plan forming in his mind was as reckless as it was desperate. Harrow's voice cut through the tension, cold as iron. "Hand over the girl, Crow, or we burn this coast to ash." His eyes gleamed with a hunger that wasn't just duty. Elias knew that look from his pirating days, the greed of a man chasing power. Kehlani gripped Elias's arm, whispering, "No, trust Taino." Her words steeled him, echoing the choice he'd made to save her. But the rogue Carib scout, scars twitching with fury, stepped forward, his knife raised toward Elias. "This outsider brought death," he roared, his voice splitting the tribe's ranks. Some warriors nodded, their spears shifting, while others looked to Taino, whose silence was a storm of its own. Elias's mind raced, his years at sea whispering a way out. The bay's tides were turning, a surge due any moment, a force that had wrecked ships and swallowed men. "Taino," Elias said, his voice steady despite the muskets aimed at his chest, "we can stop this without blood. The tide's coming. We trap him in it." He gestured to the narrow channel where the bay met the cliffs, its currents a death trap he'd navigated as a pirate. Kehlani translated, her halting English bridging their worlds. Taino's eyes narrowed, weighing Elias's words, then nodded once. "Do it," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But if you fail, we all die." The rogue scout lunged, his knife flashing toward Elias's throat. Kehlani moved faster, snatching a fishing spear from the shack's wall and swinging it with a cry, knocking the blade from his hand. The warriors gasped, their murmurs turning to awe as Kehlani stood tall, her wounds forgotten in her defiance. "He saved me," she shouted, her Carib words fierce, her eyes daring the scout to challenge her. The tribe's loyalty shifted, the rogue disarmed and silenced, his coup crumbling. Taino's nod to Elias was a pact forged in that moment, outsider and chief, bound by a girl's courage. Elias and the warriors moved fast, rigging nets and spiked driftwood across the channel, using tricks from his pirating days. The tide roared in, a beast of foam and fury, just as the soldiers charged, their boots slipping on wet rocks. Harrow's men, caught in the narrow pass, screamed as the surge hit, dragging them into the bay's depths. Muskets fired wildly, their shots lost to the wind. Elias ducked behind a boulder, Kehlani beside him, her breath ragged but fierce. Taino's warriors struck from the dunes, their arrows swift and silent, cutting down stragglers. The trap worked, the soldiers' ranks broken, their torches snuffed by the sea. Harrow, bloodied but alive, staggered from the waves, his sword drawn. "You traitor," he spat, lunging at Elias. The pirate's instincts kicked in, his cutlass parrying with a clang that echoed over the bay. "Why her?" Elias growled, pinning Harrow against a rock. The captain's sneer twisted into a confession, his voice low with venom. "The girl was bait. Spark a war, blame the savages, claim this coast for the crown." The twist hit Elias like a cannonball. Harrow had orchestrated Kehlani's attack to justify slaughter, a plot to fuel colonial greed. Elias disarmed him, sparing his life for one reason. A living confession could expose the truth. As the last soldiers fled or sank, a new sound pierced the night, the creak of rigging and the thud of cannons being rolled out. A colonial ship loomed on the horizon, its lanterns glowing like eyes of a beast. Taino's warriors froze, their victory short-lived. Elias's heart sank. The trap had won a battle, but the war was far from over. If you were Elias, would you rally the tribe to fight this new threat, or try to negotiate with a ship that wants you dead? Drop your choice in the comments because the next move will decide the fate of this coast. The colonial ship loomed over the Caribbean Bay, its cannons glinting like teeth in the moonlight, a beast ready to devour the shore. Elias Crow stood on the rocky cliff, Kehlani at his side, her wounds bandaged but her eyes fierce. Chief Taino's warriors gripped their spears, their painted faces set against the glow of the ship's lanterns. Captain Harrow, bound and kneeling, spat curses, his confession of orchestrating Kehlani's attack still ringing in the air. The tide's roar had faded, but the night was far from silent. Rigging creaked, and the distant shouts of soldiers promised a fight that could end them all. Elias, once a pirate who'd fled the world, now faced a choice that would define him: fight alongside a tribe he barely knew, or watch the coast burn. Tino's voice broke the tension, steady as the sea itself. "Crow, you saved my daughter. Will you stand with us?" Elias met his gaze, the weight of years, Marina's death, his betrayal, his solitude, pressing against the spark Kelani had reignited. "I'm done running," he said, gripping his cutlass. Kelani translated, her voice carrying a strength that silenced the last murmurs of doubt among the warriors. The rogue scout, now humbled, nodded, his knife sheathed. Elias's plan was simple but bold: use his pirating skills to board the ship, disable its cannons and turn its own strength against it. The bay was his domain, its currents and rocks as familiar as an old friend. The warriors moved like shadows, their canoes slicing through the water, silent as death. Elias led a small group, Kelani insisting on joining despite her wounds. "I fight for my people," she said, her shark jaw pendant gleaming. They climbed the ship's hull, using grappling hooks from Elias's pirating days, their movements masked by the waves' crash. On deck, chaos erupted, soldiers shouted, swords clashed and arrows flew from Tino's archers below. Elias fought with a fire he hadn't felt in years, his cutlass a blur as he cut through ropes, toppling a cannon into the sea. Kelani, wielding a stolen dagger, guarded his back, her courage a mirror of Marina's defiance in her final moments. The tide turned when Elias reached the powder magazine. A spark from his flintlock, a calculated risk, and the ship's belly erupted in a controlled blast, crippling its cannons without sinking it. The crew surrendered, their shouts drowned by the warriors' victory cries. Tino's men bound the survivors, and Elias dragged Harrow to the deck, forcing him to repeat his confession before a captured officer. "Tell Port Royal," Elias growled, "this coast ain't yours to claim." The officer, pale and trembling, nodded, his logbook now a weapon against the colonial plot. The ship, disarmed, was left to limp back to its masters, carrying the truth of Harrow's betrayal. As dawn broke, the bay glowed golden, its waves gentle as if the storm and battle had washed away the world's sins. Tino's warriors gathered on the shore, their spears lowered, their faces softened by victory. Kelani stood before her father, her voice steady as she spoke in Carib, then turned to Elias. "You are brother to our people," she said, placing her pendant in his hand. The gesture hit Elias like a wave. He'd come to this coast to escape, but now he'd found a purpose. His shack, once a hideout, would become a meeting ground for tribes and settlers, a place to forge peace, much like Kelani's dream for her people. Elias looked out at the sea, the horizon calling like it had in his pirating days. Tino offered him a place on their canoes, a chance to sail west, to new lands where his skills could carve a future. "I ain't one for stayin' still," Elias said, a faint smile breaking through years of grief. The ghosts of his past, Marina, his crew, felt lighter as if they sailed with him now. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can change the world. What's your story of courage? Drop it in the comments below because stories like this keep us going. And if you love this tale, hit that subscribe button. There's more where this came from. Click the video on the screen for another epic adventure, because Elias's journey is just beginning.